In the summer of 1992, in a hotel in St. John's, Newfoundland, a Canadian government minister prepared to deliver the worst news in the province's history. Outside the doors, fishermen were shouting and pounding, demanding to be let in. They already suspected what he was about to say. For 500 years, their families had pulled a single fish from the cold Atlantic, and that fish had never run out. It had fed armies, crossed oceans, and helped build whole nations. Off these shores lay the Grand Banks, once so thick with this fish that sailors swore you could almost walk across the water on their backs. Now the minister announced that the fishery was closed. The northern cod, the foundation of the entire region, had collapsed to about 1% of its former numbers. In a single morning, more than 30,000 people lost their work. It was the largest mass layoff in Canadian history, and it happened because a fish that once seemed endless had simply run out. That fish was cod, the same plain white fillet wrapped in batter at the fish and chip shop, the cheap fish in the freezer aisle. How did a fish so ordinary come to feed empires, draw nations to the edge of war, and then vanish from one of the richest seas on Earth? To understand that, we have to go back more than 1,000 years to a cold northern coast and a people who found a way to make this fish last. The Atlantic cod is a large, hardy fish of the cold northern seas. It swims in immense schools across the shallow banks where cold and warm waters meet, and food is rich. A single female can carry millions of eggs, and for most of human history, the supply seemed beyond all limit. The flesh is lean, white and mild, with very little fat. That low fat turned out to be the key to everything. Because it is so lean, cod can be preserved more completely than almost any other fish. Long before refrigeration, people on the northern coasts learned this through hard experience. Along the wind-blasted shores of Norway, fishermen hung gutted cod on wooden racks in the freezing winter air. The cold dried the fish slowly, without rotting, until it was stiff as a board. This was stockfish, and it could last for years without salt, without spoiling, without any care at all. It was light, durable, and packed with protein, an ideal food for a long voyage. The seafaring Norse carried dried cod on their ships as they raided and traded and pushed west across the open ocean. Some researchers believe this hard, dried fish helped power the great age of Viking expansion. It was a technology as much as a food, the work of generations who understood their coast and their climate. And it created something new in the world, a staple food that could travel anywhere, be stored for years, and be traded far from the sea that made it. That single idea, a fish that would not spoil, was about to reshape the economy of a continent. In medieval Europe, the demand for preserved fish exploded, and the reason was religion. The Christian Church set aside many days of the year for fasting, when eating meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden. On those days, which added up to nearly half the calendar, fish was the food that was allowed. Fish became not just a meal, but a religious necessity for millions of people. Fresh fish spoiled within a day and could never reach the inland towns and cities. But dried and salted cod could travel for weeks over land and sea. Cod became one of the first truly international foods, sold across the whole of Europe. In the north, a powerful network of German merchant cities known as the Hanseatic League took control of the trade. They bought dried cod in the far north of Norway and sold it across the continent at a steep markup. The little Norwegian port of Bergen grew rich as a gateway for fish moving south. Whoever controlled the cod controlled a flow of money and food that touched every kitchen and every church. Fishermen in cold and distant villages did the dangerous work. Merchants in comfortable cities far away took the largest share of the profit. It was a pattern that would repeat on a far larger and far darker scale for centuries to come. Because soon the search for new fishing grounds would send ships across an entire ocean. By the late Middle Ages, the rich fishing grounds near Europe were crowded and fought over. Fishermen needed new waters, and one group seems to have found them first. The Basques, a seafaring people from the coast between Spain and France began appearing at European markets with enormous quantities of cod. They would not say where it came from. According to a widely repeated story, the Basques had found secret fishing grounds far out in the western Atlantic and kept the location to themselves for profit. Historians debate how early they truly crossed, but their skill and their silence were real. Then, in 1497, an Italian navigator sailing for England reached a cold, fog-bound coast in the far west. He had been searching for a route to Asia. What he found instead was Newfoundland, and the sea around it stunned everyone who saw it. The water was so thick with cod that the crew reported lowering weighted baskets and hauling them back up full. They said the fish slowed their ships. News of the Grand Banks set off a rush across the Atlantic. Ships from Portugal, France, England, and the Basque country crossed thousands of miles of dangerous ocean to fish these waters every season. The cold, muggy air of Newfoundland was wrong for wind drying, so they salted the fish first and then dried it on shore. A new kind of empire was taking shape, built not on gold or spices, but on a plain white fish. And the people who would pay the highest price for it had not yet entered the story. As the Atlantic cod trade grew, it became tangled with one of the darkest systems in human history. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European powers built vast sugar plantations across the Caribbean. Those plantations were worked by enslaved Africans, taken across the ocean by force in staggering numbers. Sugar was brutally profitable, and the planters wanted every acre growing cane, not food. So they needed a cheap source of protein to keep enslaved people alive and laboring. They found it in cod. The fishermen of New England and the North Atlantic sorted their catch by quality. The best, cleanest cod was sold to Europe. The poorest, damaged, salt-burned fish was set aside as a separate grade. This low grade was called West India cure, and it was shipped by the millions of pounds to the Caribbean. There it became a staple food forced on enslaved people on the sugar islands. A merchant in a northern port could grow wealthy without ever seeing a plantation. The cod went south to feed the enslaved. The sugar and molasses came north to be made into rum. And the profits built fortunes, mansions, and whole cities along the New England coast. A class of wealthy merchants there became known, only half in jest, as the codfish aristocracy. Their comfort rested on a fish, and that fish rested on human bondage thousands of miles away. This arrangement seemed ordinary to the people who profited from it. It was not. By now, cod was far more than food. In New England, it had become the foundation of an entire economy. The fish paid for ships, churches, and schools, and it shaped the character of a young society. When that society broke away from Britain to form a new nation, the cod trade helped fund the fight. In the halls of Massachusetts, lawmakers hung a carved wooden codfish from the ceiling to honor the source of their wealth. It still hangs there today, and it is known as the Sacred Cod. Across the ocean, cod was just as vital to the great powers of Europe. Dried and salted, it fed navies on long voyages and armies on the march. It was cheap, it kept for months, and it could be carried anywhere a flag could go. Nations came to see control of the fishing grounds as a matter of national strength. The fish that fed the poor had become a pillar of empires. But demand kept rising, and the old way of catching cod by hook and line from small wooden boats could not keep pace forever. To feed a hungry, industrializing world, the hunt for cod itself would have to change. If you are enjoying this hidden history, take a moment to subscribe. Every week we uncover the forgotten story behind something on your plate, and the most dramatic chapter of this one is still ahead. The change came with steam, steel, and ice. In the 19th century, sailing boats with hand lines gave way to powerful steam trawlers. These ships dragged enormous nets across the seafloor, scooping up everything in their path. Bottom trawling could catch more cod in a day than an old crew might take in a season. It also tore up the seabed where the fish fed and bred. Then came the technology that removed the last natural limits. Engineers learned to freeze fish quickly at sea, locking in freshness for months. The breakthrough is often credited to an American inventor who had watched Arctic peoples freeze fish in the polar wind. He realized that fast freezing kept the flesh tender, while slow freezing ruined it. His methods helped create the modern frozen food industry. After the Second World War, factories turned frozen cod into a cheap, convenient product for millions. They pressed the white flesh into uniform blocks, sliced them, breaded them, and sold them as fish sticks and fish fingers. A child could now eat cod without ever seeing a bone, a fin, or a whole fish. Sonar, developed for hunting submarines, was soon turned on the cod themselves. Captains could find entire schools on a screen and chase them with deadly precision. By the middle of the 20th century, giant factory ships roamed the banks, catching, cleaning, and freezing cod without ever returning to port. The fish had little chance, and almost no one realized how quickly the end was coming. As cod grew cheap and convenient, it worked its way into daily life on both sides of the Atlantic. In Britain, fried cod in batter with chips became a national dish. Fish and chips fed factory workers, soldiers, and families through hard times and through war. It was considered so important that the British government refused to ration it during the Second World War. They feared that taking away the people's fish and chips would crush morale. In the United States and beyond, the frozen fish stick became a staple of school lunches and busy weeknights. Cod was mild, affordable, and easy to cook, with none of the strong taste that put people off other fish. Restaurants and shops sold it under many names, and most customers never knew or cared which fish was on the plate. For generations, cod was simply what fish meant to millions of ordinary people. It was the everyday protein of the working family, the school lunchroom, and the seaside holiday. Behind that cheap, familiar meal, the fishing fleets were working harder and harder for each catch. The boats had to travel farther, stay out longer, and drag bigger nets to bring home the same amount of fish. The sea was beginning to empty, but the menus stayed full, and the warning signs were easy to ignore. By the middle of the 20th century, the pressure on the cod grounds was becoming dangerous. As fish grew scarce near home, nations began to fight over who had the right to catch them. The sharpest clash came between Britain and the small island nation of Iceland. Iceland depended on cod for its survival, and it watched foreign trawlers strip its waters. So Iceland pushed its fishing boundary farther and farther out to sea. Britain refused to accept the new limits and sent its trawlers in anyway, escorted by warships. In a series of confrontations known as the Cod Wars, the two sides rammed each other's vessels on the open sea. Icelandic patrol boats used special cutters to slice the nets of British trawlers and send their catch to the bottom. No great battle was fought, and few lives were lost, but the standoff was real and tense. In the end, Iceland won. The world accepted a new rule, giving coastal nations control of the sea for 200 nautical miles from their shores. That principle still shapes the map of the oceans today. But protecting the water did not protect the fish. Off Canada, the once unimaginable was happening on the Grand Banks themselves. Decades of industrial trawling had torn through the greatest cod population on Earth. Scientists warned that the stock was crashing, but the warnings were softened, delayed, and overruled. Too many jobs, too many votes, and too much money depended on the fish staying available. And so the fishing continued until there was almost nothing left, which brings us back to that hotel in 1992 and the minister announcing the collapse. The northern cod had fallen by more than 90%, and the fishery was shut down. The closure was meant to last 2 years, just long enough to let the fish recover. Instead, it lasted more than 30, and even after all that time, the great cod stocks have only partly returned. An entire way of life, 5 centuries old, was gone in a single generation. None of this means cod is doomed everywhere, and some northern stocks remain healthy and carefully managed. But the Grand Banks remain one of the clearest warnings ever given about taking nature for granted. So look again at that plain piece of white fish in your kitchen. It is easy to overlook, mild and cheap and familiar. Yet few foods have shaped the modern world so deeply. Cod drew European ships across the Atlantic, perhaps even before the famous voyages of discovery. It fed the navies and armies that built and defended empires. It was forced upon enslaved people whose suffering paid for fortunes far away. It helped fund the birth of a new nation and hung as a sacred symbol in its halls. It started a quiet war that helped redraw the boundaries of every ocean on the planet. And then it showed us, on the Grand Banks, that even the richest wild harvest on Earth can be emptied. Today, most of the cod we eat comes from a handful of carefully watched northern fisheries. Much of what is sold as familiar whitefish is now other species standing in for the cod we lost. The plain fillet on your plate is a survivor of one of the great booms and busts in all of history. The next time you unwrap a piece of battered fish or a frozen fillet, think about what it once was. You are holding a fish that fed the poor and enriched the powerful, that crossed oceans and changed laws. Inside this ordinary fillet is a history of faith, of empire, of bondage, and of a sea pushed past its limit. Cod was never just a fish. If this story changed the way you see the food on your plate, subscribe for more hidden histories behind the things we eat every day. And tell me in the comments which part surprised you the most. Next time, the history of pineapple, the strange fruit of kings and conquest that helped topple a kingdom and built an empire of plantations. Until then, remember, there is always a hidden history behind the ordinary things.